All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to our webinar series, Stories from the Archives. In this series, we explore the stories behind the treasures and unique family history artifacts found in the special collections at American Ancestors. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors NEHGS, and I will be your moderator for today's program. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. This program today is brought to you by the Burr Family Learning Center. Our presenter today is our Senior Archivist, Judy Lucey. Judy oversees the management and preservation of the NEHGS Special Collections. She received a bachelor's degree in education from Northeastern University and a master's in library science from Simmons College. She is co-author of the Genealogist's Handbook for Irish Research and frequently contributes to American Ancestors magazine. Her areas of genealogical expertise include Ireland, the Atlantic Canadian provinces, and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, as well as New England. Now, there's nothing quite as special as family recipes passed down through the generations. Family cookbooks and recipe cards not only provide a taste of the past, but they can also tell you about the period in which an ancestor lived and breathe life into your family history research. This session will look at several examples of family recipes held in the R. Stanton Avery Special Collections here at American Ancestors. Judy will also provide tips on finding examples at other repositories and archives, and offer suggestions on what to do with such items in your personal collection. We will have time for questions at the end, so at any point during the presentation, please type your questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. There is no handout for this presentation, but we are recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can freely go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Judy.
Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome again, everyone. As always, I'm delighted to be here with you today as we continue to share stories from the archives, and today I think we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to explore some of our treasures related to food and family with recipes from our manuscript collection. So how do recipes and cookbooks come to NEHGS? And really, quite frequently, they're donated with other materials such as family papers or personal papers. Family papers often contain things like letters, diaries, and other records created by women. And it's in these records that we really hear the voices of women that are often missing in published sources. Women are frequently the keepers of family papers, so it's no wonder that we encounter their recipes and cookbooks in family materials, items that they particularly relied upon and valued. But sometimes we can find them in the most unlikely places. It's not unusual for us to find recipes in diaries and account books and commonplace books. And why would that be? Well, if an account book was used by the husband in the household, and if there were lots of blank pages in the back of the account book, paper was scarce. So women would utilize that for other purposes, including recording their recipes. So much of the recipes that we're going to discuss today are related to baking, cookies, cakes, pies, etc. And I'm going to highlight the handwritten recipes and the manuscript cookbooks from our collection. But before we dive in, I just want to mention that if you have an interest in food, specifically the history of cookery and recipes, there are places beyond NEHGS that also collect recipes and cookbooks. Many university libraries, public libraries, historical societies may have food-related items in their collection. Some, like the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe Institute, have an extensive collection of published and manuscript cookbooks. But don't overlook secondary sources either. I rely heavily on the book that you see here, which is called Northern Hospitality, Cooking by the Book in New England. I keep it at my desk because I never know if I encounter a recipe or something related to cooking and I'm unsure of or have never heard of it before. I use Keith Stavely and Kathleen Fitzgerald's book. They are a married couple, former public librarians that have published several books related to food. And here's an example that I think is worth exploring. If you haven't looked at this, this is the Feed America project. It's a cookbook collection from Michigan State University, and they have about 76 cookbooks online, ranging from 18th century to 20th century that you can take a look at and look at many of the old recipes. Now, I have to share with you my own personal family traditions. My personal love of cooking, food, and family history has now become intertwined with my professional life. I'm not a food historian, but I do care for these materials. My culinary ancestry brings together the flavors of the Mediterranean and Newfoundland with a bit of a New England accent. So my mother is Italian-American, and you can see a photo of the DeLuca family here on the right. The arrow is pointing to my mom. And thanks to her influence, eating is one of my earliest memories and one of my favorite pastimes. And my mother and her sisters kept many of the food traditions that their parents brought from Italy. My paternal grandmother, Nana, was a native of Newfoundland, and she was raised on cod. But she and her mother were quick to adopt New England favorites such as New England boiled dinner, baked beans, and steamed brown bread. So when I was a child, the kitchen was the most important room in the house. In addition to being the center for meal preparation and eating, it served as the family gathering place, as I'm sure it is for many of you. So let's explore some of the recipes and meet the woman who cooked and baked through the centuries. In 1802, English immigrant Dr. William Yates arrived in Philadelphia and then moved to upstate New York, where he married Hannah Palmer. Hannah was the daughter of Captain Ichabod Palmer and her mother, Mary Wakeley. They were of Butternuts, which is now Morris, New York, in Otsego County. The Palmers were formerly of Brookfield, Connecticut. Now, through the papers and the records and the photographs of this family and their descendants, we really see a richly documented life in 19th and 20th century America. And while men are featured very prominently throughout the collection, women are equally represented, with their voices heard through many letters and diaries and their recipes. Now, Ada Harris was the great-granddaughter of William and Hannah Yates. She lovingly preserved this collection, including all the recipes in the cookbooks that belonged to her mother, Winifred Yates-Harris, her grandmother, Ariana Durow Yates, and other female family members. And these records span 3 generations of women, and they really do provide us with a history lesson in the evolution of American cookery. Now, the earliest recipes in the collection are in a small, fragile manuscript receipt book, and its cover names the owner as Annis Palmer of Butternuts, and the date is recorded, February 27th, 1817. Annis was Hannah Palmer Yates' younger sister, and her handwritten recipes represent foods associated with colonial New England: cakes, boiled puddings, pies, and cookies. And you'll see here, just from the images that you see before you, it's just no real instructions with the baking, but simply the list of ingredients. And one of the first recipes is for election cake, which was very popular in colonial New England. And it was frequently served at the festivities sort of surrounding the colonial elections. Very, very popular in Connecticut, particularly the Hartford area. Hence, sometimes it's referred to as Hartford cake. Now, election cake is not necessarily American, invented here, but it's based on the English yeast cakes and was made of like a yeast-raised cake shaped like a loaf of bread, and it was covered in a frosting made of boiled sugar and egg whites. Now, Annis's recipe that you see here is similar to the traditional recipe found in published cookbooks of the day. Now, the number of pounds of flour is cut off here, but normally this recipe would call for 4 pounds of flour, 3/4 of a pound of butter, and 1/3 of a pound of sugar. And she also used ingredients common in the colonial period. She used a teaspoon of pearl ash. Now that's a chemical leavener, and it was made from boiling down wood ashes. And it was, you would take the ashes from the fireplace perhaps and boil it down with water, and some of that would produce almost like a lye consistency. And you would also use a pint of emptins. That would be your yeast. Emptins was a slang term that was used, and it refers to emptyings, that yeast product that came from the sediment or the dregs of wine and ale casks. Alcohol was also used in this. She used a gill of brandy. A gill is equivalent to about 4 fluid ounces. So yeast cakes like this were common in the 17th century, but by the 18th century, these recipes were being replaced with ones that included eggs and chemical leaveners like you see here, pearl ash, emptins, etc. Now, the next generation of cooks in the collection was represented by Ariana DeRoe Yates. She was born in 1844, and she married William and Hannah Yates' son, George, in 1867. Now, Hannah's recipes are inscribed in her Mama's Receipt Book, as it was called, and it includes traditional cakes, pies, puddings, but it also includes instructions for pickling and preserving fruits and vegetables and salting meats. But it also has home remedies for treating illnesses and for making household cleaning products. This is my absolute favorite recipe, I think, in the entire collection, but particularly from Ariana. It is her hard ginger cake, which lasts, according to her, for 75 years. And looking over the instructions after you've put the ingredients together, Ariana instructs the baker to roll it out very thin as possible, and then you cut it into round shapes and you bake in a quick oven. Now, this is actually more of a cookie than a cake. More sounds like ginger snaps, cookies to be exact. But the secret to its longevity was keeping the cakes in a closely covered tin box, or as Ariana wrote, better still, a stone jar, so they're airtight or else they'll become soft. So it's definitely the gift that keeps on giving. Why bake when company is coming? Just pull out the stone jar and serve. Now, daughter Winifred, Ariana's daughter, began her recipe collection in December of 1889. She actually records the date at the age of 17. And she continued collecting recipes after her marriage to William Henry Harris in 1899. Now, she collected many of the traditional recipes her mother and Annis Palmer used. For example, Indian pudding was a very popular recipe in this family. Winifred had both a baked Indian pudding and a boiled Indian pudding in her cookbook. But frequently, her recipes were shorter variations than her mother or Annis's. And as a product of her time, Winifred collected a great deal of information from newspapers and magazines. And she would paste recipes and household hints into her recipe book. And also she had a number of recipes that were given to her by neighbors and friends. What's interesting about this collection is that I would say Annis and Winifred's cookbooks in particular are separated by about 100 years. And they have, when you really examine them closely, they have markedly different experiences of cooking and baking. And I think it offers us a lens through which we can view cultural changes over a period of time. Now, the name Louisa Knapp Curtis may not be familiar to you, But if I mention Ladies' Home Journal, I think that will ring a bell. Louisa was the wife of Philadelphia publishing magnate Charles H.K. Curtis. She contributed a column in his magazine. Her column was titled Women at Home, and Curtis's magazine was called Tribune and Farmer. Her column was so popular in the day that it actually spawned a separate magazine, what is today the Ladies' Home Journal. And she served as the magazine's first editor from 1883 to 1889. Now, Louise's cookbook, as you can see here, by the Staines, was used frequently and includes many of the traditional recipes for cakes and pies, etc. But there's also recipes for some very popular condiments, such as tomato ketchup, which is the one that I show here, and also another recipe in her book called chow chow. Now, chow chow is a Northern American pickled relish, very popular in the Southern United States, is used with green tomatoes. Some say that it came to Louisiana when the Acadians were expelled from Nova Scotia. Don't quote me on that, but that's a possibility. And it can be found in different regions. Southern United States chow chow is very popular. Pennsylvania, New Mexico, the Appalachian Mountains, and also the maritime provinces of Canada. And each geographic region has different variations of the recipe. Some are sweeter than others, like the Pennsylvania chow chow is sweeter than, say, the one that is commonly used in the Southern United States. And this can be served as a dish on its own or as a condiment. Now, in Louise's cookbook is a bride's cake recipe. And you'll see here it calls for 1/2 cup of butter, 2 cups of sugar, 5 egg whites beaten to a froth, cold water, etc. So it's fairly light and almost sounds like a layer cake recipe. And you flavor this particular cake recipe with almonds. But I want to show you another bridal cake recipe that we have in the collection and compare the two. So let's look at the next slide. Now this is it's called My Wedding Cake, and I don't know where the image went to, but anyway, Elizabeth Inglesby Hallett Fisher was born in 1818 at Yarmouth, Massachusetts. And in 1839, she married William Sidney Fisher. And there are a number of recipes among Elizabeth's papers, including a very small piece of paper that says My Wedding Cake. There it is. Let's look at the next slide. I want to show you the ingredients. So there's 2 recipes written on this little slip of paper, and I'm going to share. I've transcribed the first. It calls for 7 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of sugar, 4 pounds of butter. You can use raisins or currants, and you can use gills of wine, 3 gills, and it also requires 18 eggs, molasses, and something that says 16 tablespoons of Sally Davis, which may be what they call saleratus, which was like a baking soda at the time. But you can see how dense and heavy that cake would be. Next, I want to introduce you to Elizabeth Lancaster Atkinson from the Atkinson-Lancaster papers. Elizabeth lived for a time, although she was originally from Newburyport. She and her husband lived in Calcutta, India, where he was a merchant for a number of years. And her recipe book is quite interesting. Let's take a look at that. So on this page alone, what I like about Elizabeth's book is that it's a little bit different than the other recipe books that we have in the collection. There's not just recipes just for baking, but there's other types of foods as well. So we can get a sense of the types of meals that she served to her family, such as macaroni, which is the only macaroni recipe we have in the collection. And it was made with sort of a beef soup broth. And then you boil the pound of macaroni and it's mixed with the tomato sauce and you add cheese. Something similar to what we might do today. And then her mayonnaise fish dish is really, the mayonnaise is like it's a prepared sauce that you would pour over the fish. And then the last thing on this page that we see is the Charlotte Russe pudding, which was a very popular dessert in 19th century America. and frequently served in the White House. Mary Todd Lincoln frequently served this dish when she entertained. But her recipe book also shows the Indian influences from the time that she and her family lived in Calcutta. So she has a curry recipe from Thomas. Who Thomas is, we do not know. It could have been one of the servants that she had in her household in Calcutta. She also has mulligatawny soup, which is basically a curry soup that's frequently made with chicken, vegetables, apples, and rice. Now, I mentioned earlier how many recipes can be found in other types of material we acquire, like account books and diaries, but also a commonplace book. If you're not familiar with a commonplace book, that's a volume in which the person who owns it records items that they just wish to remember. So it can include Bible passages, sermons that they may have heard, poetry, recipes, biographical details about their lives, and just interesting facts and dates. And this is the oldest recipe that we have in our collection, dating 1683. And it comes from the commonplace book of Jos Winthrop, who was born in 1666. He was the son of Dean Winthrop and Sarah Glover, the grandson of Governor John Winthrop. And here is the only food recipe in his commonplace book. It is for French biscuit. So it's basically like a cookie, but it's sort of baked twice. And it includes flour and eggs. And for yeast, it uses 1/2 pint of ale yeast. And he even gives a little instructions. You shape it like a brick, you leave it out for a day or two, you cut it into slices like toast, as he says, pour a little sugar over it, and then you put it in the oven and, until it dries. But Jos also included remedies, things for if you prick your finger under your nail. So like if you get a splinter, how can you treat that? And he provides us with a little remedy for that, where you make a plaster of turpentine and use beeswax and mutton fat and the juice of a plant. He also has something on how to stop the bleeding of your nose. If you have a bloody nose, where you put this little thing together with the juice of nettles from a plant, and you use aquavite. Aquavite was an alcoholic beverage, sometimes referred to as snaps, and it had a 42 to 45% volume, alcohol volume. And you would put this together, and that would stop the bleeding of the nose. And then you see here, that's just the blown up image of Jos's remedies for stopping a bloody nose or for a prick under the nail. So a set of recipes which includes brown bread, poor man's chowder, and gingerbread was donated to NEHGS in 1989. And unlike many of the recipes in our special collections, they're neither part of a family collection of papers, nor were they written in a family Bible or a diary. Instead, the recipes are found in the business records of a 19th century milliner. Now, we generally think of business life from this era as exclusively male, but many 19th century women owned and operated shops, stores, and other commercial ventures. One of these women was Eunice Burr Goff of Boston, Massachusetts. Now, her account book, which was kept during 1839 to 1840, really gives us some insight into both her professional life and her domestic life. And Eunice likely wrote down her recipes at about this time when she was keeping her account book. So she has, like on a page, it's titled Recipes for the Ladies, and they include things like Boston pudding and a number of cake recipes. But on the inside cover of her account book, she records her recipe of poor man's chowder, and she provides the ingredients and instructions. So you cut up some salt pork, Then you fry it in a deep iron kettle, add onions and potatoes, cook until done, make dough balls, cover with water, and again, just cook until done. And so those are basically some of the recipes and she used every piece of paper in her account book when she wasn't recording her business transactions. She recorded recipes. And here's a recipe that we found in some loose papers in the back of her account book, and they're dated July 22nd, 1900. And one is for Eunice's steamed brown bread. So Eunice died in Methuen, Massachusetts in 1874. So we surmise that her recipe must have been recalled and probably written down by a family member who remembered it and enjoyed it. I love the final comment in this recipe, which it just says good in quotations. Eunice may have made this bread when it was relatively new innovation because steamed brown bread did not appear in a published cookbook until 1862. And it's quite different from the traditional baked brown bread. The steamed version had a sort of a loose, doughy consistency to it. And you would add either sweet or sour milk and a little bit more molasses than you would with the baked brown bread. Now, when people come to special collections and they ask for the John Ford papers, they tend to want to look at Ford's military papers. He served as a captain from Chelmsford, Massachusetts. In the American Revolution, he was also involved in Shays' Rebellion. However, his daughter, Sarah, married into the Corliss family, and she preserved her father's papers. And along with her father's papers and her descendants' papers, these were given to us in 1952. And they include an account book with 12 recipes that were recorded in 1865 to about 1867. And they include the typical recipes you would find for tomato ketchup. There's also a recipe for Bartlett pudding that's made with huckleberries. And then this railroad cake that was given by Mary J. Warren to a member of the Corliss family. And Mary was from Portland, Maine. So again, you get a little bit of genealogical information in here as well, especially when you get recipes that are submitted by other people and perhaps other relatives. This small account book was kept by Ensign Eldredge Kelley. Ensign Kelley was wounded towards the end of the Civil War. And after he recovered from his wounds, he became a courier for the United States Sanitary Commission. And this was during the latter part of the war and even the months following the surrender at Appomattox. And he traveled by train between Washington and New York, caring for the sick and wounded. So the entries in his account book include the date, the soldier's name, the company and regiment he served in, the state that the soldier was from, his hometown, and sometimes occasional notes on the treatment of, for example, maybe their arm was amputated or some other information. Now, when his assignment was done, Ensign Kelley took this account book home, and the blank pages in the back were used by his wife. And in the back, we find that she recorded most of her recipes in this, mostly cakes. There are some cookies, and there's a recipe for lemon pie. So here on the upper left, you see her 6-month cake recipe, which again is a cake that can last a long time. And on the right is her snow cake recipe, which was like an angel food cake, but with butter. And sometimes people use powdered sugar on top of it. Getting back to the 6-month cake, it makes 2 loaves. And as she writes, it lasts as long as you wish. And then other recipes on this page include a fruitcake recipe and a cake recipe for Victoria cake. Now, Ensign Kelley's account book, along with his wife's recipes, are available online, and anyone can access this, even if you're not a member of NEHGS. And it's part of our Civil War collection of manuscripts in our digital library and archive. I thought we'd talk a little bit about cookbooks and schools for cookery. This is Dolly Baxter. And among the documents, letters, and photographs in the Louise Baxter Carruth papers is a diploma belonging to Dolly Baxter, her daughter, who was born in 1872. The diploma was issued by the Boston Normal School of Cookery on the 30th of March, 1892, and it proclaimed that Dolly, whom you see here on the left, was now entitled to its endorsement as a teacher of the science and art of cookery. And here is her graduating class of 1892, where you see the red arrow. Dolly is seated on the far right. She's the young lady with the glasses. Now, there were a lot of schools for cookery, but two fairly important ones. There was the Boston Normal School for Cookery that Dolly attended. That was established in 1887 by Mary Tilston Hemingway, who was a well-known philanthropist and who was very involved in vocational training and setting up schools and education. This school, I think during when Dolly attended, the course lasted a year, but by 1894, I think the curriculum had expanded to a 2-year program, and it sort of taught theory and practical cooking techniques. And to be admitted, you had to be at least 17 years of age and a high school graduate. Now, upon Mary's death in 1897, the Boston Normal School for Cookery became the Department of Household Arts in the State Normal School of Framingham. The Normal School of Framingham was sort of the state teachers' college. And Mary Hemingway Department still exists today at what is now known as Framingham University. The other popular Boston cookery school was the Boston Cooking School. This was founded earlier in 1879 by the Women's Education Association. And there were several popular teachers in this program who produced cookbooks. The first was Mrs. Mary J. Lincoln, and her book in 1887 was called Mrs. Lincoln's Boston Cookbook, What to Do and What Not to Do in Cooking. Now, the other very popular person you may have heard of is Fanny Farmer. She took and sort of redid Mrs. Lincoln's cookbook, and she published it in 1896. And in this revolutionized cooking because there was more standardized measurements in Fanny Farmer's cookbook and more standardized, I guess you would say, very specific instructions in her cookbook. Now, this recipe, Angels on Horseback, this recipe was written in Mrs. Lincoln's cookbook, which was part of Dolly's papers. And I can only guess that this may have been served, she may have used it as a textbook for her classes. But in some of the blank pages on the back, she writes and records recipes. And this is one of my favorites because it's called Angels on Horseback, which is just bacon wrapped around oysters. And just a note on oysters, these were a very popular food item in the 19th century. It was known as the great age of oyster consumption. So there was a bit of an oyster craze. Not only were they cooked and served at home, but in every town there were oyster parlors, there were oyster bars, there were oyster houses, oyster lunchrooms, etc. And the oldest restaurant in Boston, and it's still operating today, is Ye Olde Oyster House, which opened in 1826. And back in the day, it was frequented by the likes of, say, Daniel Webster. But also in the 20th century, it was frequented by members of the Kennedy family. So I thought I would end the recipe part of our presentation today with talking about some holiday recipes and menus. And I just thought I'd highlight some from our collection. So the first here is John Noble's plum pudding. John was a cooper. He lived in Chelsea, Massachusetts, as well as East Boston, Massachusetts. And his collection is just personal papers that consists of correspondence, diaries, deeds, etc. related to him and members of his family, as well as the related lines of, I think, Goodrow and Leary. And among his personal papers is just this single recipe, dated December 10th, 1908 for plum pudding. And this is the only food recipe that is in the collection. So it was obviously a favorite of John's. And so you can see I transcribed the recipe so we could see the ingredients: 3 cups of flour, 1 cup of suet. It has raisins, currants, 1 cup of good molasses, or you can use maple syrup, a teaspoon of vanilla, baking soda, salt, eggs, and citron. And you either boil or steam for 4 hours. So that's his plum pudding recipe. And it's the only plum pudding recipe I have in the collection. Now, the Nordberg family, Alex Lambert Nordberg, he arrived in the city of Boston on the 1st of January, 1908 from Sweden. And sometime back in the early 90s, the family donated an unpublished family history. And it traced the descendants of Alex and his wife, Sigrid Walter Bergstrom. But in the back, there's about 4 to 6 pages of family recipes. And one of my favorites is the soaking of lutefisk. Lutefisk was a white fish that was used, and it was served on Christmas Eve. And lutefisk literally means lye fish, because they often brined it in lye, and then they soaked it in water to remove the solution, and then they steamed it until it flaked. Now, in the Nordberg family, they soaked the fish in cold water in a wooden tub for several days. And the first note of instruction when you're doing this is that you have to in order to get it ready for Christmas Eve, you had to begin on the 9th of December. Now, the Nordbergs didn't use lye, they used slaked lime, which is kind of like calcium hydroxide. It's like a white powder. So they used that instead of lye when they were preparing their lutefisk. But they also have recipe for glögg, the Swedish drink, Nana's pancakes, Swedish pancakes, and other recipes that they brought from Sweden. In the Powell history and genealogy that we have in our collection, it includes a handwritten genealogy. It has numerous mounted newspaper clippings, letters, photographs, documents, publications. It's very much like a scrapbook type of thing. But there is a section on the Turner family, and that includes photographs of Frederick Alonzo Turner, whom you see here, with his wife, Cora Leslie Powell-Turner, and their son. And they lived in Boston, actually just a few streets from NEHGS. And you can see on the left the photo of the family, but on the right, Cora created her own holiday menus. She would do a little sketch like you see here, and then she would write out her multi-course menu. Here is an example of her Thanksgiving menu in 1887. And on the back, she records the address where the dinner was served. And in 1887, they had dinner at her parents' home in Roxbury, Massachusetts. But turkey was the main part of the menu. Soup was served first. Then there was other game that was served. And then on the menu for desserts, it included Charlotte's Russe pudding, fresh fruit, and salted almonds. And here you can see Cora's Christmas menu from 1888. And again, she records the address. This is from, I think, when they lived on Marlborough Street, 340 Marlborough Street. And the menu begins with oysters. But there's also lobster croquettes, turkey and all the trimmings. And for dessert, she serves plum pudding, mince pie, fruit, champagne, and you end the dinner with coffee. So I just want to take the next few minutes to talk about caring for your family recipes. So as we come to the end of this webinar, I just want to give you a few tips to leave you with. So you want to store your recipes and your cookbooks in proper enclosures. If you're like me, many of these items are falling apart. When my sister and I share our grandmother's cookbook, and my sister presented it to me in a Ziploc plastic bag, which I don't keep it in anymore. So you do want to put them in proper enclosures. So what would you use? Well, if you have index cards, there are archival boxes to store index cards in. But I would also recommend reformatting your recipes. And what do I mean by that? Digitizing. You know, especially if you want to share. If you're interested in sharing your family recipes, digitize them and distribute them widely throughout with your family members. If you have things, recipes folded up in envelopes and boxes, unfold them. The longer you keep these things folded, the more likely that they'll tear or separate at the folds, and then you're going to have problems. The other thing you can do is talk to a conservator or a preservation specialist. And you will have the opportunity to do that. Next month, we are going to have our annual online Preservation Roadshow in January of 2023. You will be able to submit an image of maybe one of your family treasures. Perhaps it's a family cookbook with your questions, and our conservator, as well as myself and other archivists here, will be answering your questions. And then there'll be a live session sometime in mid-January where you can ask live your questions, and Todd Pattison, our conservator, will be hosting the event. The other thing you can also do is consult this webpage. Todd Pattison, our conservator, put together very helpful suggestions for preserving your family treasures, including some short videos. And at the very end of the page is a list of vendors for archival supplies. So it has loads of information that can help you with answering some of your questions on how to preserve your family treasures. You know, if it weren't for individuals and families carefully preserving and handing down these family treasures, such as these recipes and cookbooks I shared with you today, we wouldn't know anything about the lives of these women, nor their cooking traditions that are represented in this webinar. We would not know about the Yates-Palmer family cooking traditions if their recipe collections had not been passed from one generation to the next, and if they weren't safeguarded by Ada Harris, who valued these records. All these records preserve far more than simple recipes. They offer insight into historic lives and lifestyles. They can provide us a window into social history, women's studies, you know, and even the history of technology. In each case of things that you saw today, someone had the foresight to recognize the importance of these records and donate them to an institution where the women's stories would be preserved and continued to be told and shared. Now, maybe you don't have family recipes in your collection, but you could start to create your own. But if you do, like I do, and you value those, so maybe I was thinking that maybe this year, as I prepare for the holidays, I think I'm going to forgo looking for some fancy recipe to do. I think I'm going to cultivate my own new tradition by making Nana's favorite carrot cake recipe. After all, it's tried, it's true, and it's also full of memories. Well, I want to thank you for attending today, and I'll turn it back to Kathleen for questions.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was a fascinating presentation. It's always so interesting to see these old recipes that give such a great kind of glimpse at how people lived. So thank you so much. That was fantastic. And we've been getting a lot of great questions coming in as well from all of you. So I think, Judy, I'll start with a question here from Sarah. So I know you touched on towards the end how to preserve family recipes that are in your personal collection.
Mhm.
And we have a question here from Sarah, who wants to know if recipe index cards should be removed from their metal boxes, because she has her mother's collection, which came with a metal box.
You know, it's funny because I keep my mother's index cards and I'm an archivist. I keep them in the little gray box that she still had. It's plastic. I keep it in the pantry where it's cool and dry. And I would only suggest that if it's fine for now, um, maybe you should just monitor it. You know, as long as it's not breaking down, you're not seeing things deteriorating in it, it's okay. However, if you're thinking, you know, over time, some of these things are starting to tear or whatever, you might want to remove them. But if it works for you and you just keep an eye on it, don't disrupt it. I mean, I don't have a special box for my mother's index cards. So I think it would be okay if you kept it in the tin box. Just keep an eye on it. It's always good to monitor your collections, no matter where they are in the house, whether you have them in archival enclosures or not, keep an eye on them. So as long as you do that, and if it's something that you use frequently, you know, so as long as it still works and it's holding, until you start to see if it begins to rust, that rust begins to spread, then you want to remove and rehouse.
Great, thank you so much. Great advice there. All right, so then we have an interesting question here from Nancy. She's wondering, when do we start to see changes from seeing mostly kind of handwritten recipes like we saw a lot of today, versus then more kind of published recipe clippings, Xerox type sharing, that sort of thing?
You know, I think it's around, like, I can only judge from the collection that I have, but I see it starting to happen around the time of the Civil War or after. And I can tell from the Yates-Harris collection because, of course, Annis Palmer, 1817 and 1820s was all handwritten, as was Ariana's. But I started to notice in Ariana's that she would also clip newspaper clippings from magazines, just like her daughter Winifred did. So I would say mid-19th century. And of course, now, as you saw in the Nordberg family, they did theirs computer generated in a Word doc. And we actually just have a reproduction of it. The original must still be with the family. And they actually included photos. So they made it like a little photograph book. And then where the recipes were at the very back of it, they actually included a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Nordberg sitting at the kitchen table, which I thought was kind of fun. But yeah, I think I start to see that around mid-19th century. Because cooking really, the baking is revolutionized by, I think, about 1856 with the invention of baking powder. I mean, that changed everything. I mean, you didn't have to spend hours, you know, fermenting vegetables and fruits to make yeast to make a cake. And because before that, I think I read once, making a cake before 1856 was not a piece of cake. It was hard and it was long.
Yep, makes sense why they'd want it to last for 75 years like that.
75 years.
One
I love
recipe.
that. I just love
Yeah,
it. It's my favorite.
definitely. All right, great. So then we have kind of a fun question here from Sarah, who wants to know if you've made any of these recipes or maybe some of your own family recipes.
I use my mother's a lot. And I now, because she passed last year, I regret there were just some things she knew in her head, and unfortunately she died with it. But my sister and I have been trying to recreate some of those, particularly some of the Italian, but her baking and her other dishes, she typed or wrote down on index cards. So I use those. As a matter of fact, we're going to make her date nut bread next weekend. My sister and I have set aside the weekend for baking, and we're using my mother and my grandmother's cookie recipes and my mother's date nut bread recipe. So we still use it. And I use my grandmother, my paternal grandmother from Newfoundland, who was Irish background. I use her Irish soda bread recipe a lot.
Oh, wow, that's great. I know in my family, we make an Irish potato stuffing every Thanksgiving that supposedly came over at some point from Ireland. So
Oh, that's neat.
yes, yeah. All right, so let's see here. We have some more questions coming in. So we have a question from Claudia who would like to know if you have a sense of when receipts began to be called recipes instead.
Oh, that's a good question. I can only gauge from what I have here, and I see that receipt book was used 18th century into the into the mid 19th century. And then I begin to start to see the words probably after the 1870s, 1880s to see recipe appear more. But it could show up in earlier cookbooks. But I know, for example, with Annis Palmer and Ariana Yates, they were still calling it receipt books. And that was through the mid to late 19th century.
Okay, great. And then we have a question here about our collections. Diane is wondering if we have an index of all of the recipes in our collection.
No, I have them on a spreadsheet because at one time I was hoping to do a cookbook, an NEHGS cookbook with our recipes. Never got off the ground, but I still have kept everything. And that was, I think I started that 10 years ago. I keep a spreadsheet with like all the recipes that have, and all the collections that have come, because I only touched on a few. You haven't seen all of them. I have dozens of recipes from various collections. And it's not something that we set out to collect. It's just, it comes with the normal part of our mission, our collecting them, because we focus on families. And they often come with genealogical materials or family materials, as I talked about. So they're not indexed. You just kind of have to know. And sometimes they're not well cataloged. It might say that there's recipes, like in a scope and content note in the description in the library catalog, but it won't tell you what they are. So, but yeah, it's a really good idea for us to kind of put something together in the future. I haven't given up on the idea.
Yeah, definitely. I love that idea. That would be great to see someday.
Yes.
All right, and then I think we have about time for one more question here. So this is another kind of preservation related question. So Linda's wondering if it would make sense to weed out newspaper clippings and continue just saving the index cards and handwritten recipes. I don't know if maybe there's a preservation concern with having newspaper, with the other recipes, if that might be what she's asking here.
Yeah, if you're seeing with the newspapers, if you're seeing that they're leaving, because they're highly acidic, if you're seeing that they're leaving imprints in there, blending in with the other materials that may be filed, in front or behind it, you can always get bonded paper or archival quality paper or tissue or something and put it in between. If you feel that you want to make facsimiles of the newspaper, you can do that. I have my grandmother's newspaper clippings in her cookbook, and what I've been trying to do is I have some archival quality paper, and I just cut it down to the size of the page, and I put it in between so that the newspaper clippings don't continue to break down and carry on the other pages. As for the clippings, if the clippings are fine and in good shape, it's okay. But over time, you just have to be careful because they can get rusty. And so then it becomes harder to remove and you don't want to rip anything. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt to remove paper clips or anything like elastics. You don't want elastics because as they dry, they'll stick like glue to your index cards, your paper, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Thank you. More great advice there. And thank you again, Judy. Again, this was such a fun and interesting presentation. So thank
I
you
enjoyed
so much.
It's so much fun. I don't get to talk about it as much as I used to, where when we used to do in-house events and people would come and I would do food exhibits and, put the recipes out so people could see them. We have to get to do that again sometime soon. That would be fun.
Definitely. Yeah, looking forward to it. We'll definitely plan on that.
Oh, sounds good.
All right, great. So I will go ahead and just kind of wrap things up here today. So if we didn't get to your question this afternoon, or if you do think of one later on, you can contact us at education@nehgs.org. You can also chat with our genealogists for free online Tuesday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time. And we do have extended hours for that on Wednesday evenings from 9 to 8 p.m. This service is open to everyone, and it can be accessed at americanancestors.org/chat. Thank you again for joining us, and you will have an opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on today's webinar. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any feedback is very helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Thank you again, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.